Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. Yes, I am. Yes, but I've always taken my studies seriously, so it wouldn't be quite correct to state that I do so now. I'm simply giving it a more disciplined direction. Imagine this. In his Manhattan apartment, Paul Simon is lost in thought as he gazes out at the city skyline while holding a notebook, a song circling in his mind, and a list, a private mental catalogue of crimes rather than influences. Paul Simon never put up with pretense, gimmick, or arrogance, despite his artistic silence and lyrical grace. He came to despise these 6 musicians in a subtle but noticeable way. It stems from profound emotional traumas, ideological strife, and artistic cooperation rather than small-scale antagonism. The first name is Bob Dylan, the titan he used to admire but later found intolerable. It started with awe. Prior to meeting Dylan, Simon, like many others in his generation, held Dylan in high regard in the 1960s. Dylan's lyrical abstractions, his enigmatic aura, and his feeling of invincibility all had a certain allure. At one point, Paul studied his songs as if they were scripture. However, the enchantment ended when their paths eventually intersected. Paul felt smaller and more rejected than he had ever felt in a room full of musicians because of Dylan's coldness and his barely concealed contempt for Simon's songs. At one party, Dylan whispered, "Too clever." And Simon heard him from the other side of the room. For days, the words reverberated. Erasure was more than just critique. Paul felt alienated when he departed, after coming looking for connection. Simon eventually grew to view Dylan as an adversary who would not accept his equal status rather than as a mentor. The use of passive-aggressive insults became commonplace. In interviews, Simon makes fun of Dylan's nasal drawl. Dylan makes disparaging remarks about Simon's writing. They weren't jabs. Sentences were used to conduct these cold battles. In private, Simon thought Dylan's mystique was a shadow playing a harmonica. Once, he summoned him to a buddy. It was the worst letdown in his career as an artist. He once desperately needed that acceptance, not because Dylan had let him down. Silence like that leaves a scar. If Dylan was the folk ghost, Lou Reed, its Ghostbuster, would be the next name. Simon was never a fan of Lou's snarling distance. The rough, jagged edges of the Velvet Underground seemed anti-music to someone who was fixated on melody and organization. Whereas Paul meticulously crafted tunes, Lou adopted dissonance as a philosophy. It was ideology, not simply fashion. They couldn't be more diametrically opposed. Simon recalled their encounters as icy affairs, and they briefly shared a label. Lou would arrive late, with his arms crossed as if preparing for battle, and sunglasses on indoors. It's awful to say this. It's actually quite mediocre. I believe I am one of them. I honestly don't think of myself as much more than, mediocre. Simon described L's actions as aggressively hollow, as if he were acting apathetically rather than experiencing any genuine emotions. In response, Reed mocked Paul's poise and command. He mocked music for therapists, not the good sort either. Twice, in dimly lit situations with tense civility, their worlds intersected. Lou interrupted Paul in the middle of his second statement and left without saying anything. There was no fight. It was terrible. It was a dismissal. Simon never lost sight of that. He didn't pardon it either, because he believed that disrespect didn't require loudness. All it needed was silence and a sharp enough blade. Then there was the one whose flawlessness Simon could not stand. Sting. They were frequently linked with poets of their time, featured in the same breath, and scheduled at the same festivals. However, there was a simmering tension beneath Paul's reserved manner. He became enraged at the theatrical polish, the staged authenticity, and the constant feeling that Sting was acting rather than living wisdom whenever his name was mentioned. Music was a language of scars to Simon. It seemed flawless, cerebral, and excruciatingly practiced to Sting, like drama. Sting sings like he's solving a riddle for applause, he once said to a co-worker. In 2002, Sting volunteered to duet at a fundraising gala. On stage, he even cracked a joke. One microphone, two poets. With a gleam of icy laughter behind his eyes, Paul grinned. However, he tactfully turned down any offers of further cooperation the following morning. He had returned to his hotel that evening and scrawled notes. Frantically, not for a song but as a release. He wasn't irritated out of envy. It was a letdown. To him, Sting stood for everything that music shouldn't be. Calculating, in control, and unaffected by injuries. They didn't talk again. Furthermore, Paul's silence said louder than any duet could, and it wasn't always legends that were at odds. Ed Sheeran, a star who ascended too quickly, was the next name. Simon was regarded as a hustler. He was aware of the years spent creating something sincere, the dim clubs, and the long trips. However, he found it intolerable when imitation passed for reverence. Ed's early repertoire, he once claimed, sounded like Simon and Garfunkel without the agony. That remark wasn't motivated by jealousy. It started out as grief. Sorrow over the direction that music was taking. He initially ignored it. Youth copies, after all. However, Simon didn't feel honored when Ednam dropped him on a song that portrayed Paul as some sort of creative template. He felt taken advantage of. In order to prevent scheduling them on the same festival circuits, he called and instructed his staff to refuse any requests for joint interviews. More than anyone else, he whispered to himself, "I'm not his compass." In private, Paul thought, Ed's ascent signaled a risky change. Storytelling without wounds, music without stress. Before it became personal, it wasn't. Till he started to feel like a supporting character in someone else's story, a decorative touch devoid of the scars that gave his work life. Two drastically different ideas of power then clashed. Madonna, Simon, appreciated audacity, but not when it seemed forced. He believed that vulnerability, not show, had to be the foundation of artistic expression. Off the record, he once accused Madonna of converting suffering into a product, shock into a tactic, and peddling revolt like soda pop. He didn't dislike becoming famous. He didn't like how it affected the truth. He observed that Madonna's evolution was more about marketing than growth. A prime-time sanitized version of a revolution. It was at a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame event that their paths finally collided. There was a buzz in the room. Champagne legacy in motion with flashbulbs. Madonna came up to him with the assurance of someone accustomed to being loved. She had a politician's smile, excellent posture, calculated charm. The energy was not returned by Paul. Not out of interest, but out of respect, he held out his hand. They shook hands quickly. More than any words, the tension between them was audible. He saw how fast she turned her focus to the audience and the cameras. He seemed like a prop in her act. It wasn't anger. Something colder was involved. Disappointment. His concerns about her were not just confirmed at that moment. It validated a more profound aspect of himself. That his genuineness had become an antique in a society that revered artifice. Someone later questioned him about their conversation. "Nothing," he said. The most truthful aspect of it was that disinterest was the harshest accusation in Simon's universe. And that instant, caught in the glamour of fame, signified a silent, irrevocable rejection. A single celebrity seeking a legacy, the other is only trying to find something genuine. And, lastly, Art Garfunkel, a name that left the biggest scar. In harmony, they were like brothers, until they weren't. Like temples, their voices soared together. However, tension, creative control, ego, and stillness that became as sharp as knives were hidden under the beauty. What was once sacrosanct was eroded by years of conflict, silent grudges, and unspoken regrets. Simon was not only against Garfunkel's decisions, he detested the damage they caused to his memories. Every reunion turned into a reminder of the past, not in skill, but in faith. Garfunkel's quest for solitary acclaim and his absence from significant events came across as ambition masquerading as desertion. Paul saw that there was more distance between them than history each time they stood together for a comeback. Long stretches of time without communication were interspersed with tense, fleeting encounters that served only to reopen the scars. There was stillness at the end of a Los Angeles meal. They ended up in different automobiles after a Paris picture session. When Simon saw Art smile on stage, he questioned whether it was genuine or only a mask similar to the ones they wore in their last years together. They had stopped singing. They were making it through. He missed the youngster he used to harmonize with in studios and stairwells. He missed how their voices used to automatically and instinctively find one another. However, that inclination perished in the obscurity of resentment. I loved Art like a brother, and like all brothers, I hated him too, Simon once said to a journalist in an unguarded moment. Beneath that hatred, however, lay a sorrow too great for song, a lament for a connection that music created, but that life was unable to preserve. The foundation of Paul Simon's life was sound. However, quiet also shaped him. The quiet after treachery, the pauses after insults, and the silences between friends. Paul saw music as a language that filled the gaps left by words. However, quiet composed its own poetry, and occasionally the most candid songs he never put out were those verses. He was aware that quiet may cut more deeply than music. It had hurt him during lengthy rides home from tense interviews, in backstage halls, and during unanswered birthday calls. Sound was sacred in Simon's world. However, the ghosts lived in silence, and animosity developed in such areas. Precise, but not loud or explosive. A note withheld, a harmony undone, rather than a cry in the dark. Fire did not arrive as bridges. Like dust, they settled and imprinted memory on each phrase. He remembered most of these names, but he didn't create songs about them. In the breath he decided not to take in between verses, in a word omitted, in a melody clenched into steel. Each pause was deliberate. Every omission is a protest in secret, because genius doesn't always express its anger with a yell. It hums. It allows the rage to reverberate between chords. It allows absence to be heard. All the while, Paul Simon was humming, silently, eloquently, and with a chorus-like recollection. He was never required to sing out loud. His quiet wasn't a sign of weakness. It was accurate. The poetry lacked punctuation.